Hello and welcome to this video on the types and styles of ale that are out there. Imagine for a moment you go into your local store with alcohol. You go past the wine, past the spirits, and straight to the back where the cold beer is kept in fridges. You are now staring at a wall of beer. If you turn around, there's a good chance there's a long aisle of room temperature or tepid beer too, if there are not several such aisles. The choices you can see are many. There'll be at least one side that is made of lager, and these are, well, one style of beer, and we have a video on what lager style beer is already, so switch to that if that's your thing. Okay, now that they're gone, or possibly jumping straight to the comment section to post some cringeworthy statements about the superiority of lager over ale, let's get to the meat or substance of this video. A lager is by definition a colder fermented beer. It is like ale for all intents and purposes, but fermented largely by bottom fermenting yeast at a temperature in the mid to low teens in Celsius, or around 55 to 60 freedom units. An ale is by contrast largely a top fermenter that relies on temperatures at or above 20 degrees Celsius, or about 68 freedom units or more. Traditionally it's not hopped, but this has changed to just about every modern ale. There is almost no ale available now that is not hopped, and in the case of an IPA, it is especially hopped. We can, let's say, broadly define ale into 6 categories. You have your pale ale, your Indian pale ale or IPA, your stout, porter, brown ale, and wheat beer. To keep things simple, let's go through them in order. We'll also try and add chapters to this video so you can jump to the type of ale that interests you. And that is assuming that, first of all, we remember, and that YouTube does not throw one of its random hissy fits about not letting us do so. It wouldn't be for the first time. A pale ale is the first ale, and it is perhaps the lightest of them all. Well, bad puns aside, it is fundamentally an ale made with a very pale malt. That is, it's less heated during the malting process and therefore is less coloured. It is nearly always light in colour, it has a slightly more, let's say, a bright or fruity hoppy flavour to it. It's also often described as American ale, and sometimes as English pale ale. If you're imagining something like, say, a Budweiser, you're pretty much on the money. Of course, that doesn't mean that all beer that's a pale ale is terrible. It just means that it's generally going to be somewhat less strong in its flavour. Don't get us wrong, a good-made pale ale is nice. It's just not overwhelming or excessively aggressive in its taste, aroma, and so on. They're generally more balanced, if not slightly sweeter. And next we have Indian Pale Ale, which is essentially a pale ale, but ramped up to 11. What they do this with is, first of all, with more sugars. They generally use a much more aggressive amount of malt in their mixture, or their wort to be more accurate, but they also hop it way more aggressively. This was largely done as an effort to try and make it transportable over long distances, hence the name Indian Pale Ale. It was essentially shipped across the Indian Ocean, and, well, that was a long trip at the time, and many months in most cases, meaning the beer had to be treated in such a way that it would, well, survive the entire time, and not end up as nothing but malt vinegar. The style is broadly classified as either going to be sort of East Coast versus West Coast, or perhaps sometimes also put as West Coast versus New England. The general distinction is going to be something like, let's say, the New England style are more fruity flavoured, whereas the West Coast is more hoppy and bittered. Admittedly, depending on where you are and how you define these things, it will vary drastically. We have a whole video dedicated to what an Indian Pale Ale is if you need more detail. The stout is perhaps more, let's say, notorious. Depending on where you are and your first encounter with it, your idea of a stout may be something that is incredibly dark, incredibly, let's say, harsh in its taste, and could be mistaken for basically chewing on ash. It's not, ideally, but sometimes, yes, that is basically what you are getting. A good stout should be made up of a nicely roasted malt, and that should give it a rich and creamy taste, with just a little bit of bitterness at the end. Think of it as being kind of like chocolate. Not quite, but similar in that way. A dark chocolate will still be a little bit sweet, even though it has that bitter edge to it, whereas, say, milk chocolate is, well, very sweet. A stout will be divided by its dry stout or sweet stout. The names are basically a giveaway. Sweet stout is much sweeter and is slightly less fermented extensively, or it has had sugar added after the fact. Dry stout is fermented longer or has less sugar added and therefore tastes, more astringent. It really is that simple. The only difference is that, while a dry stout would be, say, exemplified by Guinness, whereas milk stout would be slightly different again, and it varies rather more, but it generally has a more creamy texture and taste to it. Porter is similar in some ways to a stout, although again it is somewhat different, and it's different in that it does actually often have a more chocolatey flavour to it. It is somewhat more bitter, but it also tends to be more richly flavoured. There are a few variations, whether it's brown, robust, and so on. Porter comes in a variety of different tastes. So far, most of these have been at least somewhat similar, but mostly regional variations. The brown ale is essentially a precursor to these in some respects. It is a very dark brown ale that is a slightly nutty flavour. It's generally made with a mixture of malt, both pale and dark, which means it's generally going to be not quite as dark as a stout or a porter, but it will still be a dark beer, or a dark ale in this case. It's again divided by basically which side of the Atlantic you're on, whether it is that you're on the English side or you're on the American side. The English ale tends to be somewhat milder with a more pronounced nut flavour, while the Americans tend to have a stronger barley flavour to it, or hops flavour, and they tend to be somewhat more bitter given the process of malting. And then the final broad classification is wheat beer. Now, a wheat beer is more of a continental or basically mainland Europe thing. It's mostly done using top fermenting yeast, but they use a lot more wheat instead of barley, which, given its name, shouldn't be that much of a surprise. The other thing to note here is that because there's so much more wheat involved, it doesn't darken to anywhere near the same extent. A lot of the wheat beers will be very pale, and they often get the name of white beer when translated into English, whether that is, say, Weizenbier or Witbier, which is a white beer in both German and Belgian respectively, and generally you would see it listed as something like German Weizenbier or Belgian Witbier, which is kind of ironic given that it's basically saying German white beer. Yeah, it's dumb. But hey, not everyone recognizes other languages, so we'll forgive them. These are your, let's say, broad and basic types of ale. There are other types again that we need to get into because they come under the umbrella of ale, but they tend to be, let's say, not necessarily unique, but they don't generally get covered as widely by most commercial scale brewing, although you may still encounter them. It includes things like Lembic beer, Irish ale, German ale, and Belgian beer. Now, we're not going to go into all the details on Lembic beer, simply because it's a very wide topic, and again, we have an entire video dedicated to it. Just understand that, unlike most ale, this is essentially a sour beer. It might sound odd to say that, but one thing that makes it unique is partly the presence of certain bacteria that add a significant amount of flavour to it, along with the yeast that converts the sugars into alcohol. Now, the flavours that you get from this will vary notably, not just from season to season, but between breweries, and it can vary wildly. It can sometimes be very dry, sometimes be more like a wine, and sometimes it can be more like a cider. You'll find a flavour that suits you from a certain brewery, and our advice is to stock up while you can, as you may not get that taste again. For more details, we have the full video on this, and you can find it in the top right corner and in the description box below. Irish ale, which is generally called Irish red ale, is, well, a type of ale that predominantly gets made in Ireland, where most of the malt production process in other places tends to be done in the malt house. In Ireland, it was done using a kiln and the roasting of the barley. This contributes to its red coloration. Not that surprising given the name, but also it tends to be sort of middling its alcohol concentration, but some of them can be significantly higher, as much as 6%. So just note that although the actual production process for the malt in the barley itself is different, the end result is not necessarily that distinct. You'll get a different coloration and you may get different flavorings based on local choice of barley and similar. Then we have essentially the German beer varieties. Now, these are primarily going to be derived from Cologne. Now, the reason they're derived from there is there's a massive beer heritage there. And what happens particularly is that they use less wheat than other regions. And this is where they get a little bit more unique in Germany itself, because as we mentioned, German beer tends to be much higher in wheat versus barley, and as a consequence lower in malt. There's also the fact that, particularly in Cologne, you get, let's say, particular yeast varieties that are used, and these result in a particular flavor profile. These tend to lead to a more fruity flavoring, something more akin to a cider or a wine than a beer. The other noteworthy effect is that some of their beer, on average, is slightly more alcoholic, although only by 0.5% or thereabouts. The other consideration are your other continental beers, Belgian and French styles in particular. They get defined in different ways. You have, say, a table beer, which is basically a beer that is just barely alcoholic, and fundamentally it's more like drinking a slightly alcoholic cordial, given it adds flavour rather than alcohol. A session ale is slightly different again, as this is more akin to what we would imagine to be a regular ale. That is somewhere between 3 and 5% alcohol. They're basically just regular ale. Admittedly, the varying styles and how they're made in both, say, Belgium, France, and even parts of Europe that we haven't mentioned so far, the variation can be notable. We then have dark ales, so essentially going back to things like, say, your porter and stout, but these are the mainland European equivalents. Again, there's not a lot of distinction to be drawn other than there's generally a greater amount of esters by comparison. What, let's say, distinguishes them is that they nearly always have significantly more alcohol. We're talking anywhere between 7 and 12% by comparison. Most, let's say, American or, say, British beer tends to be somewhere around 3 to 5%. This is up to, well, in some cases up to 2.5 times the highest level. And then finally, there is a weird French beer, and it's essentially called bière de garde, and it translates to tell you what it is. It's a beer for keeping, and it's a beer that's intended to be stored for a longer period of time. Now, as a general rule, it's not readily available outside of Europe, but it does come up every now and then. What it has is a greater degree of sweetness due to the malting and the amount of malt used. It's also got a very wide alcohol range of between roughly 4.5% and 8%. The flavour is most notably full of esters, and it's rather sweet. The coloration is also quite, light in most instances, although in some cases it can begin to verge on red. This is a very broad description of what an ale is. We say broad as every style or origin of a style, the particular type of beer, and so on, nearly always has its own subtypes variations, and in some cases, local variations on an international variation. And you could keep going with the number of different ways you could do this. But it's essentially an incestuous family tree of beer. The only difference is that, unlike an incestuous family tree, where your mother's sister's brother something kin is going to be, well, probably not around for very long, some of these beers have a very old history and arguably can trace their ancestry back quite a ways. And of course, whatever's coming out next and the god-awful offspring that they create is for, well, Satan to imagine at this rate. Thank you for watching this video. If you have found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. And please do post any comments, questions, or suggestions you have below.